When Lucas Reed, a successful black lawyer, becomes the target of a calculated smear campaign orchestrated by a corrupt executive and a racist police officer, his world begins to unravel. Framed with falsified evidence, Lucas faces public humiliation, unjust accusations, and systemic racism that exposes the lengths some will go to tear down a man they refuse to accept. As betrayals mount and his reputation hangs by a thread, Lucas confronts the deep-seated prejudice and abuse of power that threatens to destroy everything he's worked for. Will he stand strong against a system designed to silence him? The steady hum of the hospital machines filled the cold, sterile room as Isabel James sat at the edge of the bed, her trembling hands cradling her father's frail ones. The man who lay unconscious before her was unrecognizable. Pale skin, thinning hair, and an oxygen mask obscuring his face. Yet to the world, he was still Charles Weston, the revered CEO of Weston Industries, a titan in the corporate world. To Isabel, he was something far less impressive, a ghost of a father who had abandoned her and her mother decades ago. "Ms. James," a nurse said softly from the doorway, breaking Isabel's thoughts. "Visiting hours will end soon." Isabel nodded absent-mindedly, her gaze locked on her father's face. This was the first time she'd seen him in over 20 years. Growing up, she'd wondered what he looked like, how his voice sounded, and why he had walked out without a word, but her mother, Eloise, had never spoken much about him. "It's better that way," her mother used to say, brushing away Isabel's questions. "Sometimes silence protects us." But that silence had never brought Isabel peace. Now here she was, called by strangers to the bedside of a dying man who hadn't spared her a second thought all her life. She almost laughed at the cruel irony of it all. As she reached for her coat, preparing to leave, the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't a nurse. A tall, elegant woman entered, her high heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She looked to be in her late 40s, immaculately dressed in a cream blazer and matching skirt, her platinum hair pulled into a perfect chignon. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. Isabel straightened, her heart thudding. "I'm Isabel James." The woman's expression faltered, the name clearly triggering recognition. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the leather handbag she carried. "And what exactly are you doing here?" Isabel's jaw tightened. "He's my father." The woman's face went pale, and for a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint beep of the machines. Finally, she managed to speak, though her voice trembled. "No, that's impossible." Isabel didn't blink. "It's not, and it's about time someone faced the truth." The soft jingle of the diner's bell echoed through the quiet morning as Lucas Reed stepped inside, his polished black Oxfords tapping softly against the tiled floor. The smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee greeted him, comforting and familiar. Outside, the early light streamed in through the large front window, casting long streaks of gold across the checkerboard floor and the peeling red leather booths. Lucas had always liked places like this, small, unassuming, and grounded. He slid into the corner booth near the window, a spot he often chose during his visits to Wayland, the kind of small southern town where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. Lucas had grown up not far from here, in a cramped two-bedroom house with his grandmother. Back then, his life was all about stretching every penny, patching hand-me-down clothes, and hearing sermons about hard work at the local church. These memories sat with him like an old friend, one he didn't mind revisiting. A waitress approached, a young woman with a ponytail and a notepad tucked against her hip. Her eyes flicked to Lucas, and then away quickly, like she wasn't sure what to make of him. He understood that look. It wasn't hostility, not exactly. It was more the uncertainty of someone who didn't expect to see a man in a tailored charcoal suit sipping coffee in their diner at 7 in the morning. "You need a menu?" she asked, chewing on her gum. Lucas smiled, the kind of warm, easy smile that seemed to make people less guarded. "Just coffee for now, black, please." The waitress jotted it down without looking up. "Sure thing." She didn't ask his name. Most of the regulars here didn't need to introduce themselves, but Lucas didn't mind being the odd one out. He was used to blending into spaces that didn't quite know how to place him. Outside, the street bustled with small-town rhythms. A father in worn jeans walking his daughter to school, a farmer's truck rattling down the road, and a group of construction workers laughing loudly as they started their day. From this window, Lucas could have been anyone, just another traveler passing through. And that suited him fine. But Lucas Reed wasn't just anyone. At 43, he was the managing partner of Reed Holloway, a prominent law firm headquartered in Atlanta. He'd been on the cover of legal magazines, led multi-million-dollar cases, and defended clients in the highest courts. His reputation stretched far beyond Georgia's borders. People called him brilliant, relentless, a powerhouse in the courtroom. But here in Wayland, sitting quietly in a diner that still sold 99-cent coffee, Lucas was just another man with a tired smile and a cup in front of him. He liked that. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting the steaming mug down a little too hard. Some sloshed over the edge onto the saucer. "Here you go," she said flatly. "Thank you," Lucas replied, still polite. He watched as she turned away quickly to serve someone else, noticing how her demeanor shifted when she greeted the older couple at the table next to him. A warm smile, a chirpy tone. Lucas turned his focus back to his coffee, unbothered. He'd seen this sort of thing before. A lifetime spent navigating spaces where his presence didn't quite fit had taught him how to let small slights roll off his back, but it wasn't always easy. As he sipped, Lucas took a moment to study the room. The diner was a patchwork of mismatched chairs and faded photographs of the town's glory days, pictures of football teams, harvest festivals, and prize-winning livestock. The regulars sat in their usual spots, catching up on local gossip and town politics. Then, the door jingled again. "Morning, Judge Henderson." The room seemed to brighten as a stout, white-haired man entered, his round face breaking into an easy grin. Lucas recognized him immediately. Judge Clifford Henderson, a long-serving local figure. Lucas had appeared before him once years ago, fresh out of law school, when he was still cutting his teeth on small cases. The man's tendency to call order with a grin and crack terrible jokes from the bench hadn't changed. Judge Henderson ambled toward the counter, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on Lucas. He paused for a moment, clearly surprised, before his face split into a friendly smile. "Well, I'll be," Henderson bellowed, loud enough for half the diner to turn. "Lucas Reed in my neck of the woods? What brings the big-shot lawyer back to Wayland?" Lucas stood, extending his hand. "Good morning, Judge." The older man took it with a hearty shake, leaning in conspiratorially. "You know, I still tell that story about the time you beat me to a ruling smartest young lawyer I'd ever seen." Lucas chuckled. "You were gracious about it, gave me a lot of confidence back then." The judge's laughter echoed through the room, drawing curious glances. Lucas could feel the shift. Suddenly, people who hadn't looked twice at him were paying attention. A few whispered to each other, glancing his way as if trying to place him. Henderson clapped Lucas on the back. "You sticking around? You ought to let me take you to dinner. My wife's been wanting to meet the lawyer that made me look like a fool." Lucas grinned. "That's kind of you, Judge, but I'm just passing through a little business, that's all." "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me." With one final pat on the shoulder, Henderson made his way to the counter. Lucas sat back down, his coffee cooler now. Across the room, the waitress stared at him, the realization dawning on her face like a slow sunrise. She didn't come back to refill his cup, but she didn't ignore him either. Lucas had seen this happen time and again, how quickly perception shifted when people realized who he was. The door opened a third time, letting in a gust of warm air, and three men dressed in work shirts and heavy boots. They were loud, full of energy, and their chatter carried easily across the small space. Lucas didn't look up at first, keeping his focus on the files in his bag, but he caught snippets of their conversation. "You hear about that deal they're making big bucks rolling in?" "Yeah, but not for people like us." One of the men laughed dryly. "Story of our lives, huh? The big guys at the top get richer, and we keep scraping by." Lucas felt their frustration, the bitterness that came from working hard for too little. It was a feeling he knew too well, one he'd seen in his grandmother's tired hands and his mother's quiet sacrifices. As the men settled into a booth across from him, Lucas noticed how their voices dipped, their eyes darting toward him. He was used to the weight of those stares, the quiet questions they carried. What's he doing here? Who does he think he is? Lucas kept his gaze steady on his files, though he didn't miss the way one of the men muttered under his breath. Fancy suit like that doesn't belong in this place. The others snickered, and for a moment, Lucas felt a flicker of irritation, but he let it pass. He had long ago learned to measure his battles. Instead, he calmly folded the paper he was reading, and reached for his bag, preparing to leave. "Hey man!" one of them called out suddenly, loud enough for the room to hear. Lucas paused, looking over. The man was smirking, his tone mocking. "You lose your way to the country club?" The diner quieted. All eyes were on Lucas now. Lucas stood slowly, smoothing his suit jacket with measured calm. He met the man's gaze directly, his voice steady but firm. "No, I came here for the coffee, but if you're recommending the country club, maybe I'll stop by." The man's smirk faltered, and Lucas didn't wait for a reply. He turned on his heel, nodding to Judge Henderson on his way out. "Always a pleasure, Judge." "Take care, Lucas." Outside, the morning was brighter now, the sun climbing higher into the sky. Lucas took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. He had learned long ago how to leave moments like that behind him. But something lingered this time. A subtle shift he couldn't quite shake. As he climbed into his car and pulled away, Lucas's phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A name flashed across the screen, and he felt his stomach tighten. He grabbed the phone, pressing it to his ear. "Lucas Reed. Mr. Reed, we need you back in Atlanta immediately. There's a situation unfolding." "What kind of situation?" The voice hesitated. "It's about your firm and your name." Lucas's jaw tightened. The past, it seemed, wasn't done with him yet. Lucas's car hummed quietly as it navigated the narrow, tree-lined roads out of Wayland. The sun had risen fully now, painting the rolling fields in golden hues, but Lucas barely noticed. The call from his office lingered in his mind, a seed of unease taking root. "It's about your firm, and your name." Those words replayed like a broken record, each repetition scraping at his composure. Whatever was happening back in Atlanta couldn't be good, but he pushed the thought aside for now. He needed to focus on the road ahead. Lucas spotted the gas station up ahead, one of those mom-and-pop places with a single pump and a handwritten "Restrooms for Customers Only" sign taped to the door. He wasn't far from the interstate, but his fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, so he pulled in. The gas station was deserted, except for an older man in faded overalls and a worn cap leaning against the counter. Inside, Lucas grabbed his wallet and stepped out of the car, taking in the smell of diesel and the faint whine of cicadas in the distance. Inside, the door creaked as he entered. The old man glanced up, eyes narrowing for the briefest moment before settling into a practiced, neutral expression. "Morning," Lucas said with a nod. The man grunted in response. "Pumps pay inside." "How much?" "Fill up on pump 2, Lucas replied, placing his card on the counter. The man's gaze flicked to Lucas's tailored suit, then to his watch. An understated but elegant timepiece Lucas had received as a gift after winning his first big case. "That yours?" the man asked, nodding toward the car through the grimy window. "Yes," Lucas answered evenly. The man didn't respond, just swiped the card slowly. Too slowly, Lucas caught the slight twitch in his jaw, the unspoken question behind the man's narrowed eyes. "What's a man like you doing with a car like that?" The machine beeped, signaling approval. The old man handed the card back stiffly. "All set." Lucas thanked him and returned to the pump, shaking off the moment like dust on his shoulders. He'd faced these looks before, the subtle microaggressions that insinuated, "You don't belong here." Still, they chipped away at him, bit by bit, no matter how many times they came. As he pumped gas, a police cruiser pulled into the lot, gravel crunching beneath its tires. Lucas glanced over as 2 officers climbed out, a tall, broad man with sharp blue eyes and a younger officer trailing behind him. They strolled toward the station, casual in their steps, but Lucas could feel their gaze slide toward him. "Morning, gentlemen," Lucas offered politely, keeping his tone neutral. The older officer paused, sizing him up. "That your car?" Lucas glanced at the sleek black sedan, then back at the officer. "Yes, sir. Is there a problem?" The officer raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Just making sure. Nice ride." "Thank you." The officer lingered a beat too long, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if waiting for Lucas to fumble or offer an explanation. Lucas didn't. He kept his posture relaxed, though his grip on the pump nozzle tightened. Finally, the officer gave a half-smile, more dismissive than friendly, and turned to enter the store with his partner. Lucas exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus on the rhythmic click of the pump. It didn't surprise him, this quiet scrutiny that followed him like a shadow. Even now, standing beside a car he'd earned with years of sweat and sacrifice, he felt the weight of their assumptions. As he replaced the nozzle, the cruiser's door slammed. Lucas looked up to see the younger officer approaching him, his expression hesitant but determined. "Sir," the officer began, "can I see your license and registration?" Lucas froze, the words hitting him like a cold wind. "Is there a reason for that request?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "We're conducting routine checks. You fit a description we were given earlier." Lucas felt his pulse quicken, but his face remained calm, measured. "What description would that be?" "It's just standard procedure," the officer replied, dodging the question. Lucas stared at him for a long moment, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. With deliberate precision, he handed over his license and registration. "I trust this won't take long." The officer avoided his gaze as he took the documents and walked back to the cruiser. Lucas's jaw tightened as he watched them. Inside, frustration gnawed at him, the old familiar anger clawing at his chest. He had nothing to hide, and yet here he was, standing by his car, as if he were under suspicion simply for existing in this place. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Lucas stood still, his breathing slow and steady, his gaze locked on the cruiser's windshield. He could see the officers inside, talking quietly and occasionally glancing his way. Finally, the older officer stepped out and walked toward him, his boots crunching against the gravel. Lucas held his ground, his expression unreadable. "Everything checks out," the officer said flatly, handing back the documents. "Thanks for your cooperation." Lucas met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than necessary. "Of course." The officer hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but then gave a stiff nod and turned back to the car. Lucas slid his wallet back into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. He climbed into his sedan, shutting the door with a quiet finality. His hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment as he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He saw the calm surface, the sharp suit, the clean lines of his face. But underneath, the storm churned. "You fit a description," those words echoed in his mind, dragging memories to the surface. Being pulled over as a teenager for walking too quickly through his own neighborhood. Being followed by security guards at high-end stores. Being doubted in courtrooms until he opened his mouth and proved his worth. Lucas took a deep breath and started the engine, the quiet rumble grounding him. He pulled away from the gas station, refusing to look back at the officers who still watched him. The interstate stretched out ahead of him, a winding ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Georgia countryside. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts drifted. He thought of his grandmother, who had taught him to carry himself with quiet dignity, no matter the weight pressing down on him. "Don't let them see you break," she'd say, her voice steady as she helped him tie his church shoes. "Strength isn't loud, Lucas. It's what you carry inside." She had been right, of course, but sometimes that strength felt heavy. So heavy that Lucas wondered how long he could carry it alone. The buzz of his phone pulled him back to the present. He pressed the Bluetooth button on the steering wheel, and his assistant's voice filled the cabin. "Mr. Reed, I've got some updates. You're going to want to see this." Lucas frowned. "What happened?" There was a pause. "It's complicated. A claim's been filed against the firm, allegations of misconduct." Lucas's grip on the wheel tightened. "Misconduct? Who's behind it?" "That's the thing. It's anonymous, but it's spreading fast. A few news outlets picked it up already." Lucas's mind raced, connecting dots that didn't quite align. Reed Holloway had always maintained an impeccable record. His record. For an allegation like this to emerge now, out of nowhere, was no coincidence. "Schedule a meeting with the partners. I'll be back by noon," Lucas said, his voice firm. "Yes, sir." The call ended, leaving Lucas alone with the hum of the tires on the road. A chill crept up his spine, a feeling he couldn't shake. This wasn't just about the firm, someone was targeting him. As the city skyline finally appeared on the horizon, Lucas pressed the gas pedal a little harder, a new fire burning in his chest. He had spent years building his name, his legacy, brick by brick, fighting tooth and nail for every inch of ground. And now, someone was trying to take it all away. He wouldn't let them. The hum of conversation in the conference room hushed the moment Lucas entered. All 6 partners of Reed Holloway sat around the long, polished table, their expressions tense. The firm's skyline office offered a stunning view of Atlanta's downtown, but today, no one seemed to notice. Lucas, Sarah Mitchell, the senior partner and a trusted ally, stood to greet him. Her gray suit was as sharp as ever, but concern darkened her usually composed features. "Thank you for getting here so quickly." Lucas nodded as he took his seat at the head of the table, placing his briefcase on the ground beside him. "Tell me everything." One of the younger partners, Jared Monroe, shifted nervously in his seat, avoiding Lucas's gaze. "The allegations broke late last night. An anonymous whistleblower claims the firm manipulated financial settlements in several high-profile cases." Lucas frowned deeply. "That's absurd. We've never mishandled settlements. Every deal we've brokered has been above board." "We know that," Mitchell interjected firmly, her voice steady. "But the allegations are gaining traction. 2 major news outlets ran with the story this morning. If this isn't handled quickly, the damage to our reputation could be catastrophic." "What evidence do they claim to have?" Lucas asked sharply. Monroe cleared his throat, finally looking up. "Emails, bank transfers, documents supposedly signed under your name." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Under my name, I've signed no such documents." "We believe that," Mitchell said quickly, but the unease in the room was palpable. Partners glanced at one another, some murmuring doubts behind pursed lips. "Then someone's fabricated them," Lucas said, his voice measured, though the anger simmered beneath. "If these allegations target me specifically, then this is deliberate, it's personal." "Do you have any idea who might be behind this?" Monroe asked cautiously. Lucas glanced at him, his jaw tightening. Elliot Crawford. The thought struck him like a hammer, and for a moment, everything clicked into place. The phone calls, the gas station incident, the strange scrutiny from law enforcement, all of it suddenly felt coordinated. "It doesn't matter who," Lucas replied, pushing the suspicion aside for now. "What matters is proving this is false. I want every shred of these so-called documents. I'll review them personally and expose whoever's behind this." A soft knock on the glass door interrupted him. The firm's receptionist poked her head inside, her face pale. "Mr. Reed, there are reporters in the lobby. A lot of them." Lucas stood, straightening his jacket. "I'll handle this." Lucas stepped into the lobby to a wall of flashing cameras and microphones shoved toward his face. The voices of reporters rose like a tide, each question louder than the last. "Mr. Reed, are the allegations true? Did Reed Holloway defraud its clients? Mr. Reed, will you be stepping down as managing partner?" Lucas held up his hand, commanding silence. "These allegations are baseless. Reed Holloway has always operated with the highest integrity, and we will prove it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He turned sharply and strode toward the elevators, ignoring the cacophony that followed. Each step echoed through the marble-floored lobby, but inside, Lucas's thoughts churned. Someone wanted him taken down, and they were willing to play dirty to do it. Lucas sat alone in his office, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside him. His phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time that day. News alerts, missed calls, and emails from concerned clients. It felt like the walls were closing in, but Lucas refused to crack. The door opened quietly, and Sarah Mitchell stepped inside, closing it behind her. She held a file in her hands, her expression grim. "Lucas. What is it?" She hesitated. "You're not going to like this." She slid the folder across the desk. Lucas flipped it open, his stomach sinking as he skimmed the pages, copies of bank statements, contracts, and falsified emails, all bearing his name. The timestamps and signatures had been forged expertly, but Lucas knew the truth. "This is a setup," Lucas said, his voice low. "Whoever's behind this knows what they're doing." "Lucas," Mitchell hesitated, her tone softer now. The board is getting nervous. Jared's already talking about temporarily suspending you until this is resolved. Lucas looked up sharply. Suspending me based on lies? I know it's unfair, but this firm can't afford to bleed clients. We have to think about the bigger picture. Lucas's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He knew Mitchell meant well, but the words stung. After years of building this firm's reputation from the ground up, this was how quickly the foundation could crack. I'll clear my name, Lucas said quietly. And I'll find out who did this. Mitchell nodded, her gaze steady. I'm with you, Lucas, just be careful whoever's behind this isn't playing fair. The drive home was uneventful, but Lucas's thoughts raced. He parked his car outside his townhouse and noticed the unmarked black sedan across the street. They were watching him. Lucas climbed the steps to his front door, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But as he reached for the doorknob, a voice called out, "Mr. Reed!" He turned just as two uniformed police officers approached, led by Officer Daniels, the older cop from the gas station earlier. Daniels wore a smug expression, his hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon. "What's this about?" Lucas asked, keeping his voice calm. "Lucas Reed?" Daniels said, his tone mocking formalities. "We have a warrant for your arrest, fraud, embezzlement, you know the works." Lucas froze, the world tilting slightly around him. "You're joking." Daniels smirked. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" "I'm not resisting, but this is a mistake," Lucas said firmly, holding up his hands. "I want to see that warrant." "You'll see it downtown," Daniels snapped. He gestured for the younger officer to move in. "Cuff him." Lucas didn't resist, though humiliation burned hot in his chest as cold metal locked around his wrists. His neighbors stood at their windows, some stepping out onto their porches to watch. Whispers traveled like wildfire. "Is that Lucas Reed? What's going on? Did you hear what they're saying he did?" Lucas kept his head high as the officers led him to the cruiser, Daniel's grip unnecessarily tight on his arm. "I hope you're enjoying this," Lucas said quietly. Daniels leaned closer, his voice a low, triumphant whisper. "Men like you think you can buy respect, don't you? But the world always catches up." Lucas didn't respond. He slid into the back of the cruiser, the door slamming shut behind him. As the car pulled away, Lucas looked out the window at his quiet street, now a stage for his humiliation. For the first time in a long time, doubt crept into his mind. Was this what they wanted? To tear down everything he'd built piece by piece until there was nothing left? No. Lucas's jaw tightened as the city lights blurred past. Whoever was behind this had underestimated him. They thought they could bury him in lies and whispers. But Lucas Reed had spent his whole life fighting to be seen, to be heard. And now, they'd given him a reason to fight back harder than ever before. Hours later, sitting alone in a stark interrogation room, under flickering fluorescent lights, Lucas's resolve crystallized. Across from him sat a man he didn't recognize. Sharp suit, slick smile, and cold eyes. "Mr. Reed," the man said smoothly, leaning forward. "I think we can help each other." Lucas stared at him, unblinking. "Who are you?" The man smiled, his teeth gleaming. "Let's just say I work for someone who doesn't want this to get messier than it needs to be. All you have to do is walk away, step down, and this goes away quietly." Lucas's heart pounded, but his voice was steady. "And if I don't?" The man's smile faded. "Then we ruin you permanently." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You tell whoever you work for that I don't scare easily." The man's cold eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Suit yourself, Mr. Reed, but you've been warned." As the man left the room, Lucas sat in the silence, his hands still cuffed to the table. They wanted war? They were about to get one. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing an unflattering glare onto the cold metal table in front of Lucas. His hands were no longer cuffed, but the red marks on his wrists were a reminder of how far they'd gone to humiliate him. The air in the small interrogation room was stale, suffocating, yet Lucas sat perfectly still, his face calm, his mind sharp. He had spent hours here already. Silent, patient. They'd brought no real charges, just vague accusations and veiled threats. He knew the game: wear him down, make him question himself, and then corner him into making a mistake. But Lucas wasn't a man who cracked under pressure. The door creaked open, and Officer Daniels entered, a smug grin plastered across his face. He carried a manila folder under his arm and tossed it onto the table with a theatrical thud. "Long night, huh?" Daniels said, pulling up a chair and straddling it backward like a man settling in for a show. "You're a tough guy to crack, Reed, but don't worry, we've got all the time in the world." Lucas didn't respond. He folded his hands on the table, meeting Daniels' gaze with a silent, unwavering calm that made the officer's grin falter ever so slightly. "You know, you people," Daniels continued, emphasizing the words like a dagger between the ribs. "You get a little money, a nice car, and suddenly you think you're above the law. But guys like me, we know better." Lucas raised an eyebrow, his voice low and measured. "People like me?" Daniels leaned forward, his voice dropping to a sneer. "Don't play coy, I see you for what you are, some hotshot lawyer who thinks he can waltz in here, throw around his big words, and walk out untouched. But here's the thing, Reed, out there, in the real world, you don't get to win." Lucas didn't flinch. "If I'm not free to go, then charge me. Otherwise, I'd like to speak to my lawyer." Daniels barked out a humorless laugh. "Your lawyer big talk coming from someone whose firm is about to go under, everyone's turning on you. Reed news outlets are running the story non-stop. Your clients are jumping ship, even your precious partners are starting to lose faith." Lucas felt a flash of anger flare in his chest, but he swallowed it down. That's what Daniels wanted. For him to crack, to show weakness. Instead, Lucas sat straighter, his voice as smooth as glass. "I didn't realize we were here to chat about my reputation. Officer Daniels, is there a reason I'm still sitting here, or are we just passing time?" The smile slipped off Daniels' face. "You're real cocky for a man in your position." He pushed the folder across the table. "You'll want to take a look at that courtesy of our friends upstairs." Lucas hesitated before opening it, but when he did, his stomach dropped. Inside were photos, grainy images of financial documents, bank transfers, and emails, all bearing his name. A few included invoices that tied him to supposed payouts for settlements that never happened. It was fabricated, but damning. "This is a forgery," Lucas said evenly, though his pulse hammered in his ears. Daniel smirked. "Oh sure, that's what they all say." Lucas slammed the folder shut, his calm veneer cracking just enough to let his frustration bleed through. "You know this is fake, just like I do." Daniels's expression darkened. "All I know is you're up to your neck in fraud, and your little empire is crumbling. My advice, start cooperating before this gets worse." Before Lucas could respond, the door opened again, and Sarah Mitchell stepped inside. Her presence was like a lifeline. She was still in the same sharp suit, but exhaustion lined her face. "That's enough," she said, her voice firm as she glared at Daniels. "He's done here." Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but Mitchell cut him off. "Unless you have new evidence or a formal charge, you're holding him illegally, we're leaving." Daniels muttered something under his breath but stood, shoving the chair back roughly. "Fine, have it your way." He jabbed a finger at Lucas. "But this isn't over, not by a long shot." Lucas rose to his feet, adjusting his jacket. "You're right, it isn't." Daniels stormed out, leaving Lucas and Mitchell alone. She gave him a weary look. "You okay?" Lucas nodded, though the tightness in his chest remained. "They're pushing hard, Sarah. Someone wants me broken." "I know," she said softly, handing him his phone and watch. "Let's get out of here." The night air hit Lucas like a slap as he stepped into the parking lot. The flashing cameras and microphones were waiting, the reporters like vultures circling prey. Lucas had seen his fair share of media frenzies, but this felt different. Personal. "Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed." The voices blurred into one as the cameras flashed. Lucas ignored them, walking briskly toward Mitchell's waiting car. "Is it true you've been accused of fraud? Will you resign from Reed Holloway? Do you have a statement for your clients?" Lucas paused at the last question, his pulse steadying. He turned to face the crowd, his shoulders squared. "I'll say this," he began, his voice cutting through the noise. "These allegations are false. I have spent my life building my name on integrity and hard work. I will not let lies or manufactured evidence destroy that. The truth will come out. And when it does, the people behind this will face justice." Before the reporters could ask more, Lucas turned and climbed into the car. Mitchell started the engine, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Not bad," she said, glancing at him. "You looked strong out there." "I have to be," Lucas replied, his voice quiet. "If I break, they win." The townhouse was dark when Lucas entered, his footsteps echoing through the quiet space. He loosened his tie and sank onto the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. For the first time that day, the weight of everything hit him like a punch to the gut. His firm, his reputation, his career, everything he'd worked for, was hanging by a thread. Whoever was orchestrating this knew exactly where to hit him: his pride, his legacy, and the fragile line of trust between him and the world. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. "You were warned, Lucas. Walk away before it's too late." Lucas stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He typed a single response: "I don't back down." The reply came almost instantly: "Then you'll lose everything." Lucas exhaled slowly, forcing himself to calm the storm brewing in his chest. They were trying to intimidate him, trying to make him doubt himself. But Lucas Reed had faced worse odds before, and he had always come out stronger. He stood, his mind clear for the first time in hours. This wasn't just about him anymore. Whoever was behind this had underestimated his resolve, and that was their biggest mistake. Lucas grabbed his phone and dialed Mitchell. She picked up on the first ring. "Lucas? I need a list of all the cases I've won against big players over the last 5 years. Every client, every opposing firm. Someone has a grudge, and I'm going to find out who." "You think this is revenge?" Lucas's voice was steel. "I think someone's afraid of what I represent, and I intend to remind them exactly who I am." As he hung up, Lucas felt something shift inside him. The humiliation, the doubt, the anger. It all coalesced into something sharper, stronger. Resolve. Whoever had come for him had just made a fatal miscalculation. They'd underestimated Lucas Reed, and now, he was going to make them regret it. Across town, in a dimly lit office, a figure sat behind a mahogany desk, staring at a file marked Lucas Reed. "He's not backing down," the figure said to someone across the room. "Then we push harder," came the response. "His firm, his friends, his family, whatever it takes, break him." The figure smiled faintly, fingers steepled. "Let's see how much he can take before he shatters." The conference room buzzed with tension as Lucas sat at the head of the table. Across from him sat Jared Monroe, his once nervous demeanor now replaced by an unsettling calm. To Monroe's right, 2 representatives from the firm's major clients sat with tight lips and guarded expressions, clearly unsettled by the storm swirling around Reed Holloway. At Lucas's side, Sarah Mitchell was the picture of controlled anger, her eyes flicking toward Jared like she was ready to pounce at the first sign of further betrayal. "You called this meeting, Jared," Lucas said evenly, keeping his voice calm despite the pounding of his pulse. "Let's hear what you have to say." Jared cleared his throat, a slick smile sliding onto his face. "Thank you for coming, Lucas. I'll get straight to the point. This situation is out of control. Your name is in the headlines, clients are pulling out, and the board is considering your suspension, pending an investigation into the allegations." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "And I assume you're behind that push?" "I'm acting in the best interest of the firm," Jared replied, feigning innocence. "Reed Holloway's reputation comes first. If stepping aside would clear the air, even temporarily, don't you think that's the right move?" Lucas stared at Jared, unblinking. The pieces fell into place, each one sharper than the last. "This isn't about the firm, is it? This is about you." The slick smile faltered. "Just for a moment. What are you suggesting?" Lucas leaned forward, his gaze pinning Jared in place. "You've wanted me out since the day I became managing partner. You didn't like that someone like me, someone you underestimated, could outrun you. I earned my place here. You've spent your career trying to take it." One of the client representatives shifted uneasily. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should—" "No," Lucas said sharply, holding up a hand. "They need to hear this." He turned his attention back to Jared, his voice calm but cutting. "You orchestrated this entire attack, planted the forged documents, leaked them to the press, and used our enemies to turn suspicion against me, and for what, a shot at my chair?" Jared scoffed, but the flicker of panic in his eyes betrayed him. "You're grasping at straws, Lucas. Do you hear yourself? The paranoia. Save it, Lucas said coldly, pulling a folder from his briefcase. I had my suspicions, so I started digging. You're sloppy, Jared. He slid the folder across the table. Monroe's face paled as he opened it. Inside were screenshots of encrypted emails, messages between Jared and anonymous contacts, conversations that coordinated the falsified documents and orchestrated the media smear campaign. Sarah Mitchell spoke for the first time, her voice icy. You really thought you could bury him, Jared? You're not half as smart as you think you are. The room fell silent. The two client representatives exchanged shocked glances, their confidence in Monroe crumbling with each passing second. Jared slammed the folder shut, his mask of composure shattering. You don't have proof these messages came from me, he hissed. This is circumstantial at best. Lucas didn't blink. Do you want to test that in court? Because I'm willing. I'll subpoena every traceable email, every phone record, and when I'm done, your career will be ash. Jared's lip curled in anger, his fist clenching on the table. You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think you belong in a room like this? There it was. The truth, ugly and undeniable, spilling out in a moment of unchecked rage. Lucas leaned back, his voice cool and steady. I don't think I belong, Jared. I know I do. The room sat in stunned silence as Jared realized his misstep, but the damage was done. The clients who had once listened to him now watched him with disgust. Mitchell, still glaring, spoke up. I'll be drafting your resignation letter, Jared. You can either sign it or wait for the full board to vote you out when we present this evidence. Jared's face twisted with fury, but he said nothing. He shoved back his chair, storming out of the room without another word. The silence that followed was heavy. One of the client representatives cleared his throat, his voice cautious. Mr. Reed, we appreciate the transparency. We'll need to review this, but... Lucas nodded, already regaining control of the room. I understand. You can rest assured, Reed Holloway will take every step to clean up this mess and protect our clients. The representatives nodded, satisfied for now, and excused themselves. When the door finally closed, Sarah exhaled a long breath, slumping back in her chair. You did it, she said softly, shaking her head in disbelief. You turned it around. Lucas met her gaze, his shoulders still rigid. Not yet. This isn't over. The evening sky was painted deep purple when Lucas pulled up to his townhouse. He could see the black sedan parked across the street, its headlights off, its silhouette ominous. He'd had enough. He stepped out of his car, his polished shoes crunching against the pavement. He walked across the street with purpose, straight toward the sedan. The window rolled down halfway, and there, sitting behind the wheel, was Officer Daniels. Lucas crossed his arms, standing just outside the vehicle. How long are you planning to follow me? Daniels smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. Just doing my job, Reed, making sure you're staying out of trouble. You call harassing me? Doing your job? Lucas shot back, his voice sharp. Or is this part of the favor you owe Jared Monroe? Daniels's smirk faltered. What are you talking about? You think you're untouchable because of your badge, Lucas said, his voice low but powerful. But I know you've been working with Monroe. I have the emails, the phone calls, the connections. Monroe wanted to frame me, and you offered to help. How much did he pay you to do his dirty work? Daniel's face hardened, the false bravado slipping. You're bluffing. Lucas didn't flinch. You want to find out? I've already reported this to Internal Affairs. Your days of hiding behind that uniform are numbered. The two men stared each other down, the tension crackling like static in the air. For the first time, Lucas saw something shift in Daniels's eyes. Fear. You don't know what you're messing with, Daniels muttered, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Oh, I know exactly what I'm messing with, Lucas shot back, and I'm done being polite. He stepped back from the car, the cold night air filling his lungs, as Daniels glared at him one last time before rolling up the window. The black sedan roared to life and sped away, disappearing into the dark. Lucas stood in the quiet street, his heart pounding, but his resolve stronger than ever. He had faced down two men who thought they could destroy him, Monroe's ambition and Daniel's corruption, and he had won. But he knew this wasn't the end. They would come back harder, try to strike from the shadows. But Lucas Reed wasn't afraid of the dark. As Lucas walked up the steps to his home, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "This is Lucas Reed." A voice he didn't recognize replied, cold and calculated. "You may have won this round, Mr. Reed, but you're not out of the woods yet. If you don't back down, you won't just lose your firm, you'll lose everything." The line went dead. Lucas lowered the phone slowly, his jaw tightening as he stared out into the darkness. They were desperate now, and desperation made people dangerous, but Lucas was ready. He would finish what they started, no matter the cost. The cold steel of the courthouse steps pressed against Lucas Reed's polished shoes as he stood staring up at the imposing building. The storm clouds overhead churned like a reflection of the turmoil brewing inside him, dark and ready to break. The time for maneuvering in shadows was over. Now, it was war, out in the open, where everyone could see. Beside him, Sarah Mitchell adjusted her glasses, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension. "Are you sure about this? We don't know how deep this goes yet." Lucas nodded, his expression resolute. "We're not waiting for them to strike again. We take the fight to them, now." Sarah exhaled, falling into step beside him as they climbed the steps. "If this backfires—" "It won't," Lucas cut her off firmly. "Because I'm not backing down." At the top, a press gaggle waited just outside the courthouse doors. Their cameras turned toward Lucas like vultures sensing blood. Flashes popping as reporters shouted questions, Lucas ignored them, brushing past and into the building's marble-floored lobby. Inside, the stakes were waiting. Lucas strode into the small courtroom, the scent of polished wood and stale paper hanging in the air. It was a closed hearing, called at Lucas's request. His chance to go head-to-head with the orchestrators of this plot, in front of a judge who would have to hear the truth. At the far table sat Jared Monroe, a man who'd once pretended to be his ally, his expression smug as ever. Beside him, Officer Daniels loomed large, his uniform an ill-fitting symbol of authority. The two men whispered to each other, their confidence a thin veneer that Lucas could see straight through. As Lucas took his seat, he didn't bother looking away. He stared Monroe down, and this time, it was Jared who shifted uncomfortably. The judge entered, a stern woman with a sharp gaze that demanded order. "This hearing is to address the allegations of financial misconduct levied against Mr. Lucas Reed," she began, her voice echoing off the chamber walls. "Mr. Reed has petitioned to present new evidence to contest these claims." Lucas rose smoothly to his feet. "Thank you, Your Honor." He approached the bench with the quiet confidence of a man who'd prepared for this moment. He was not just defending himself now, he was taking control. Lucas turned to face Jared and Daniels, his tone calm but cutting. "Let's start with the truth." He walked to the projector screen, clicking his remote to bring up a slide of encrypted emails, ones he'd pulled with the help of a private investigator. "These emails prove coordination between Jared Monroe and Officer Daniels," Lucas began. "The same emails that led to falsified evidence being presented to the media and this court." Jared's face darkened, his confidence fracturing. "This is ridiculous," he barked. But Lucas didn't falter. He clicked to the next slide, financial statements that tracked a payment to Daniels' account. This wire transfer shows Jared Monroe funneling funds to Officer Daniels' personal account just days before the allegations surfaced. Daniels' face twisted in fury. "That's a lie," he shouted, rising from his chair. "This man's trying to save his skin." Lucas didn't flinch. "Then explain where the money came from, Officer Daniels. Was it a coincidence, or did Jared Monroe hire you to destroy my career?" The room fell deathly silent. Daniels' fists clenched, his face turning red as the judge rapped her gavel for order. "Sit down, Officer Daniels," she said sharply. Daniels dropped back into his seat, glaring daggers at Lucas, but the cracks were visible now. Lucas turned to Jared, his voice unwavering. "And you, Jared? You wanted me gone so badly that you put the integrity of this entire firm and the justice system at risk, all because you couldn't stand to see me succeed." Jared's face contorted with rage. "You think you can stand here and accuse me?" He sprang to his feet, pointing at Lucas. "You don't belong here, you never did. You're nothing but a—" "Enough!" the judge's voice boomed. Jared froze mid-sentence, his face pale, the weight of his own words echoing back at him like a slap. Lucas didn't move. He let Jared's own venom hang in the air, exposed for everyone to see. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice quiet but powerful. This is what happens when men like Jared Monroe feel threatened. They weaponize bias, corruption, and lies to tear down anyone they can't control. I earned my place in this firm. I earned my success. But the idea of someone like me, a black man from a working-class background, sitting at the top, it terrified you. Jared's mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of the room had shifted. Lucas continued, addressing the judge now. Your Honor, this evidence proves the lengths they went to frame me. I've spent my entire life working for my name, for my integrity, and I won't let anyone take that away from me. The judge nodded slowly, her gaze heavy as she scanned the files Lucas had presented. This court will review the evidence, she said firmly. For now, I am dismissing these allegations against Mr. Reed, pending further investigation into the actions of Officer Daniels and Mr. Monroe. A low murmur filled the room as the judge stood and exited. As soon as the gavel struck, Monroe surged to his feet, his face flushed with rage. He stalked toward Lucas, his voice a hiss. This isn't over, Reed. You think you've won, but you haven't. You'll never be more than... Careful, Lucas cut him off, his voice like steel. You've already said enough to bury yourself. Jared stopped short, his jaw working as he searched for a retort. He had none. The once confident man now looked small, stripped of the power he'd wielded in the shadows. Daniels pushed past Lucas roughly, muttering under his breath. You're going to regret this. Lucas didn't blink. No, officer. I think the regret is yours to carry now. Daniels glared at him for a long moment, then stormed out, leaving the door swinging behind him. Sarah approached, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. You did it, she said softly. You exposed them. Lucas exhaled, a small breath of relief escaping him. It's not over, he replied. They're desperate now. People like them don't give up easily. Hours later, Lucas sat alone in his office, the city lights sprawling out beneath the wide windows. The silence was heavier now that the adrenaline had faded. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. They're gone, but we need to stay vigilant. Monroe still has connections. Lucas stared at the message for a moment, then set his phone down. The fight wasn't over. Even in victory, uncertainty loomed like a shadow. His thoughts turned to Daniel's threat. You're going to regret this. They would regroup, of that Lucas had no doubt. Men like Jared Monroe and Daniels didn't know how to lose, but Lucas also knew one thing for certain. They'd made a grave mistake. They'd tried to tear him down, to strip away everything he'd worked for, but they'd underestimated him. And now, Lucas Reed would be ready. The sun hung low over Atlanta, bathing the city skyline in hues of deep amber. From his office window at Reed Holloway, Lucas Reed watched the day wind down. The events of the past weeks had felt like a storm raging through his life, unrelenting, chaotic. But today, there was a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar. Behind him, Sarah Mitchell entered the room, a stack of neatly organized documents tucked under her arm. Her expression was softer than it had been in days, though the lines of fatigue still etched her features. It's official, she said, setting the papers on his desk. The board accepted Monroe's resignation. The partners want to meet with you tomorrow to discuss moving forward. Lucas turned, a quiet nod his only response. It wasn't victory he felt, at least not entirely. More like relief. And Daniels? Sarah smirked, a rare glimpse of satisfaction in her typically reserved demeanor. Internal Affairs had enough to launch a formal investigation. Once those payments surface, he won't be wearing a badge for much longer. Lucas exhaled slowly, the weight he'd been carrying for weeks starting to lift. Piece by piece, Jared Monroe's betrayal, Officer Daniels' corruption, the attack on his name and legacy. All of it had unraveled under the harsh light of truth. But there was no triumph in exposing men like them, only the realization of how far some would go to protect their power. They underestimated you, Sarah said quietly, studying him. They thought you'd break. Lucas met her gaze, his tone steady, because men like Monroe and Daniels only see the fight in people who look like them. They think dignity, hard work, none of it matters if they decide you don't belong. Sarah's expression softened further. And you showed them they were wrong. Lucas nodded. He had, but at a cost. The attacks had been calculated and brutal, and they had laid bare the quiet, persistent reality he'd always known. No matter how successful he became, no matter how far he climbed, he would still face battles others never had to fight. 2 days later, the news broke across every major outlet. Law firm executive resigns amid allegations of corruption and fraud. The headlines detailed Jared Monroe's ties to falsified evidence, secret payoffs, and his desperate attempt to frame Lucas Reed for financial misconduct. The story spread like wildfire, tarnishing Monroe's reputation beyond repair. Clients who had begun to question Reed Holloway rallied behind the firm once more, their faith restored in the leadership they had trusted. For Monroe, there would be no recovery. His career was over. At a small press conference outside the courthouse, Lucas stood before the cameras, the eyes of reporters once again fixed on him. This time, there were no accusations, only questions seeking clarity and closure. "Mr. Reed, how do you feel now that the truth has come out?" Lucas took a measured breath, looking directly into the sea of lenses and microphones. "This was never just about me, it was about standing up to those who use their positions to tear others down. Men like Jared Monroe and Officer Daniels believe their power makes them untouchable. But no one is above accountability. I hope this sends a message. The truth will always find its way." The reporters murmured as Lucas turned and walked away, the questions trailing behind him like whispers in the wind. Later that afternoon, Lucas received a call from the district attorney's office. Daniels had been taken into custody following a formal investigation. It turned out Monroe's payments were just the tip of the iceberg. Daniels had a history of coercion, misconduct, and intimidation, all swept under the rug for years by those who benefited from his silence. Lucas made a point to visit the courthouse the next day as Daniels was led inside in handcuffs. The officer's eyes met Lucas's across the crowded hall. Gone was the smug arrogance, in its place was something smaller, something closer to fear. Lucas didn't gloat, he didn't need to. He simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the fall. Daniels had brought upon himself that evening. Lucas sat across from Sarah, in a quiet bar just a few blocks from the firm. The amber glow of the lights reflected off their whiskey glasses, the atmosphere calm and far removed from the chaos they'd just endured. "You know," Sarah began, swirling her glass, "you could have walked away, taken a deal, avoided the fight." Lucas smirked faintly, taking a sip of his drink. "I've spent my whole life walking into fights I didn't ask for. Why stop now?" She raised her glass in a toast. "To proving them wrong." Lucas clinked his glass against hers, but didn't echo the sentiment. Instead, he looked past her, his gaze distant. "It's not about proving them wrong, it's about reminding myself, and everyone like me, that we belong here, that we earned our place." Sarah studied him, understanding settling between them. "You're right. But don't forget, you didn't fight alone. The firm's still standing because you brought us with you." Lucas nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you, Sarah, for not giving up on me." She shrugged, but the warmth in her expression betrayed her pride. "It's what allies do." A month later, as Lucas walked through the halls of Reed Holloway, the firm buzzed with new life clients who'd once hesitated had returned, and new opportunities poured in. But more importantly, something had shifted, an awareness, a new resolve to protect the integrity of what they stood for. In the aftermath of Monroe's exposure, other firms began examining their own leadership and practices. Whispers of systemic issues turned into conversations. Investigations were launched. And while Lucas knew the change wouldn't happen overnight, it was a start. One day, he received an email from a young law student. The subject line read, "Thank you for showing me it's possible." Lucas smiled as he read it. The student, a black man just beginning his career, had followed Lucas's story and found in it the strength to keep going. "I almost gave up, but watching you fight reminded me why I started this journey. People like us can change the system, no matter how hard they try to keep us out." Lucas sat back in his chair, the words lingering with him. This fight had never just been his, it belonged to everyone who had been told they didn't belong, and it wasn't over. On a quiet Saturday morning, Lucas visited his grandmother's grave for the first time in months. The cemetery was empty, save for the birds singing softly overhead. He knelt beside the simple stone, brushing the leaves away. "Grandma," he said softly, his voice steady. "I did it, I stood my ground." He paused, his gaze drifting to the sky. "They tried to take everything from me, but I didn't let them. You taught me to fight with my mind, with my heart, and I hope I made you proud." The wind rustled the trees as if answering him, and Lucas smiled faintly. He stood, straightening his shoulders as he looked out at the horizon. There would be other battles. Of that, he had no doubt. The world wouldn't change easily, but Lucas Reed had faced the worst they could throw at him, and was still standing stronger, wiser. Ready for whatever came next. As he walked back to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a call from Sarah. Lucas answered, his voice calm and sure. "Reed speaking." "Lucas, you won't believe this. We just got an invitation to lead a new legal initiative on systemic reform. They want us to oversee it." Lucas smiled, a fire rekindling in his chest. "Then let's get to work." As Lucas drove back into the city, the skyline rose before him like a promise. A promise of more work to do, more ground to gain. He had weathered the storm and exposed those who would silence the truth. And though the fight wasn't over, he knew one thing for certain. No one would ever take his name, his legacy, or his dignity from him again. He wouldn't let them. The steady hum of the city surrounded Lucas Reed as he stood in the heart of downtown Atlanta, just outside the gleaming glass building that housed Reed Holloway. Traffic moved in measured waves, the sidewalks alive with people, each one carrying their own battles, their own struggles invisible to the world. Lucas had always known this to be true. But after everything he had faced, the weight of that reality felt sharper, clearer. For the first time in weeks, the world felt still. Lucas turned, gazing up at the towering skyscraper, a symbol of everything he had built. Not just the success, but the fight that came with it. The building had withstood the storm, and so had he. But he knew this wasn't just about survival. It was about moving forward, stronger, and with purpose. Inside, Sarah Mitchell awaited him in the conference room. When Lucas stepped in, she looked up from the legal briefs she'd been reviewing, offering a rare, genuine smile. "Back so soon? You were supposed to take a day off." Lucas smirked faintly, setting down his briefcase. "You know I don't do off." She studied him for a moment, the look in her eyes deeper than professional respect. "You've changed, you know," she said softly. "You're different now." Lucas paused, considering her words. She wasn't wrong. "I had to be," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "People like Monroe and Daniels, they forced me to look at the truth. It wasn't just about me, it was about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. Every person who's had their success questioned because of how they look or where they come from. They thought they could silence me, Sarah, but all they did was remind me of why I fight." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "So what happens now?" Lucas exhaled, the weight of the question lingering in the room. "Now, we rebuild. Not just the firm, but what it stands for. We're going to take on cases that matter: systemic reform, civil rights, holding people like Daniels accountable. I'm done pretending that winning in the courtroom is enough. It has to mean something." Sarah's smile widened slightly. "It's going to be a long road." Lucas met her gaze, his expression resolute. "The best roads always are." Later that evening, Lucas found himself on his mother's porch, the creak of the old wood beneath his shoes, a sound that carried him back to his childhood. The house, with its peeling paint and small front yard, had been the center of his world growing up. It was where he'd learned to dream, to work, and to believe in something bigger than himself. Vanessa Reed, his mother, stepped out of the house, a warm mug of tea in her hands. She sat down beside him on the porch swing, handing him a cup of his own. "You're quieter than usual," she said, her voice soft but knowing. Lucas chuckled faintly, taking a sip. "Just thinking." "About what?" He stared out into the night, the stars faint but present above the distant city glow. "About all of it: Monroe, Daniels, the firm, the fight I didn't ask for, but had to take on." Vanessa nodded, her face calm, though her eyes reflected years of hard-earned wisdom. "You were never one to back down. Even as a little boy, You'd fight to make yourself heard. Lucas smiled softly. I guess I didn't know how else to be. She turned to him, resting a gentle hand on his arm. You've made me proud, Lucas. Not just for winning, but for the way you did it. You didn't let them take away who you are. Lucas met her gaze, his voice quieter now. I almost let them. There were moments where it felt like the weight was too much. But I thought about you, about everything you went through to make sure I had a chance. Giving up wasn't an option. Vanessa smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. You carry the fight of so many on your shoulders, Lucas. But don't forget, you don't have to carry it alone. He nodded, her words sinking in. She was right. The battle for dignity, justice, and respect wasn't his alone. It was shared by so many, each step forward built on the sacrifices of others who had fought before him. The weeks that followed Lucas's victory brought with them a ripple effect that no one could ignore. Monroe's exposure and Daniel's arrest made headlines not just for their scandal, but for what they represented. Cracks in a system that too often shielded the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Across the city, communities began to organize, demanding accountability and reform. Conversations about racial bias, corruption, and systemic injustice grew louder. No longer whispers confined to backrooms, Lucas's fight had given people a focal point, a reminder that justice was worth pursuing, no matter how steep the cost. Reed Holloway, once shaken, found new life under Lucas's leadership. Cases focused on systemic reform poured in, and the firm took on a renewed purpose. Lucas led the charge, his presence in courtrooms now carrying a sharper weight. He was no longer just a brilliant lawyer, he was a symbol of perseverance, of standing firm when others tried to knock you down. And he wasn't done yet. One afternoon, Lucas stood in a lecture hall at a local law school, invited to speak to a class of aspiring lawyers. The room buzzed with energy, students filling every seat, their notebooks open and pens poised. Lucas stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of faces, each one filled with promise and hope. When I first started my career, he began, his deep voice commanding quiet, I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I was good enough, I could rise above the bias, the doubt, the barriers. I thought I could outwork the system. He paused, his gaze steady. But the truth is, the system isn't broken, it was built this way, and men like Jared Monroe and Officer Daniels, they thrive in it. They count on people like me, like you, to give up, to back down. They want us to believe we're alone in the fight. The room was silent now, every student hanging on to his words. But we're not alone, Lucas continued. And we don't win by running away from the fight. We win by showing up, by refusing to let them silence us, by demanding the respect and justice we deserve. A young black woman in the front row raised her hand. Mr. Reed, do you ever feel tired of it all, of having to fight so hard just to be seen? Lucas nodded, his voice softening. Every day. But that's how I know the fight is worth it. Because when we fight, we don't just fight for ourselves, we fight for the people who come after us, for the ones watching, waiting to see if it's possible. The students erupted into applause as Lucas stepped back from the podium, a small smile on his face. He had felt tired before. Yes, but standing here, seeing the next generation ready to take up the torch, he felt something stronger. Hope. That evening, as Lucas walked through the streets of Atlanta, he looked out over the city that had shaped him, its beauty, its flaws, its contradictions. He knew there would always be another battle, another fight to face, but he was ready for it. The events of the past weeks had tested him in ways he'd never imagined, but they had also made him sharper, stronger. Jared Monroe and Officer Daniels had tried to break him, to erase him. Instead, they had made him impossible to ignore. Lucas Reed had faced their worst, and he was still standing. And as long as there was injustice to fight, he wouldn't stop. He walked into the night, the city alive around him, his mind clear and his purpose resolute. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun.